If we had any hopes or illusions about the National Party before they came into office, we were disabused of them quickly. Their threat to put the Kafir in his place was not an idle one. Apart from the Suppression of Communism Act, two laws passed in 1950 formed the cornerstones of apartheid: the Population Registration Act and the Group Areas Act. As I have mentioned, the Population Registration Act authorized the government officially to classify all South Africans according to race. If it had not already been so, race became the sine qua non of South African society. The arbitrary and meaningless test to decide black from colored or colored from white often resulted in tragic cases when members of the same family were classified differently, all depending on whether one child had a lighter or darker complexion. Where one was allowed to live and work could rest on such absurd distinctions as the curl of one's hair or the size of one's lips. The Group Areas Act was the foundation of residential apartheid. Under its regulations, each racial group could own land, occupy premises, and trade only in its own separate area. Indians could henceforth only live in Indian areas, Africans in African, Coloreds in Colored. If whites wanted the land or houses of another group, they could simply declare the land a white area and take it. The Group Areas Act initiated the era of forced removals, when African communities, towns, and villages in newly designated white urban areas were violently relocated because the nearby white landowners did not want Africans living near them or simply wanted their land. At the top of the list for removal was Sophiatown, a vibrant community of more than 50,000 people, which was one of the oldest black settlements in Johannesburg. Despite its poverty, Sophiatown brimmed with a rich life and was an incubator of so much that was new and valuable in African life and culture. Even before the government's efforts to remove it, Sophiatown had a symbolic importance for Africans disproportionate to its small population. The following year, the government passed two more laws that directly attacked the rights of Coloreds and Africans. The Separate Representation of Voters Act aimed to transfer Coloreds to a separate voters' role in the Cape, thereby diluting the franchise rights that they had enjoyed for more than a century. The Bantu Authorities Act abolished the Natives Representative Council, the one indirect forum of national representation for Africans, and replaced it with a hierarchical system of tribal chiefs appointed by the government. The idea was to restore power to traditional and mainly conservative ethnic leaders in order to perpetuate ethnic differences that were beginning to erode. Both laws epitomized the ethos of the nationalist government, which pretended to preserve what they were attempting to destroy. Laws stripping people of their rights were inevitably described as laws restoring those rights. The Colored people rallied against the Separate Representation of Voters Act, organizing a tremendous demonstration in Cape Town in March 1951 and a strike in April that kept shops closed and school children at home. It was in the context of this spirit of activism by Indians, Coloreds, and Africans that Walter Sisulu first broached the idea to a small group of us of a national civil disobedience campaign. He outlined a plan under which selected volunteers from all groups would deliberately invite imprisonment by defying certain laws. The idea immediately appealed to me as it did to the others, but I differed from Walter on the question of who should take part. I had recently become national president of the Youth League, and in my new role I urged that the campaign should be exclusively African. The average African, I said, was still cautious about joint action with Indians and Coloreds. While I had made progress in terms of my opposition to communism, I still feared the influence of Indians. In addition, many of our grassroots African supporters saw Indians as exploiters of black labor in their role as shopkeepers and merchants. Walter vehemently disagreed, suggesting that the Indians, Coloreds, and Africans were inextricably bound together. The issue was taken up at a meeting of the National Executive Committee, and my view was voted down, even by those who were considered staunch African nationalists. But I was nevertheless persistent, and I raised the matter once more at the National Conference in December 1951, where the delegates dismissed my view as emphatically as the National Executive had done. Now that my view had been rejected by the highest levels of the ANC, I fully accepted the agreed upon position. While my speech advocating a go-it-alone strategy was met with a lukewarm reception, the speech I gave as president of the Youth League after the league pledged its support for the new policy of cooperation was given a resounding ovation. At the behest of a joint planning council consisting of Dr. Moroka, Walter, J.B. Marks, Yusuf Dado, and Yusuf Kachelia, the ANC conference endorsed a resolution calling upon the government to repeal the Suppression of Communism Act, the Group Areas Act, the Separate Representative Voters Act, the Bantu Authorities Act, the Pass Laws, and Stocks Limitation Laws by 29 February 1952. The law was intended to reduce overgrazing by cattle, but its impact would be to further curtail land for Africans. The council resolved that the ANC would hold demonstration on 6 April 1952 as a prelude to the launching of the campaign for the defiance of unjust laws. That same day, white South Africans would be celebrating the 300th anniversary of Jan van Riebeck's arrival at the Cape in 1652. 6th April is the day white South Africans annually commemorate as the founding of their country, and Africans revile as the beginning of 300 years of enslavement. The ANC drafted a letter to the Prime Minister advising him of these resolutions and the deadline for repealing the laws. Because the letter was to go out under the name of Dr. Moroka, and Dr. Moroka had not participated in the writing of it, I was instructed to take him the letter by driving to his home in Thaba, Nehu, a town near Bloemfontein in the Orange Free State, a very considerable area of the country. I almost did not make it there to see him. Only a few weeks before I had taken my driving test. In those days, a driver's license was an unusual thing for an African, for very few blacks had cars. On the appointed day, I borrowed a car to use for the test. I was a bit cocky and decided to drive the car there myself. I was running late and was driving faster than I should. As I maneuvered the car along a side street that met a main road, I failed to look both ways and collided with a car coming in another direction. The damage was minimal, but now I would certainly be late. The other driver was a reasonable fellow and we simply agreed to pay our own expenses. When I reached the testing station, I observed a white woman ahead of me in the middle of her test. She was driving properly and cautiously. When the test was finished, the driving inspector said, "Thank you. Would you please park the car over there?" gesturing to a space nearby. She had performed the test well enough to pass, but as the woman drove over to the parking place, she did not negotiate a corner properly and the black wheel jumped the curb. The inspector hurried over and said, "I'm sorry, madam, you have failed the test. Please make another appointment." I felt my confidence ebbing. If this fellow tricks a white woman into failing her test, what hope would I have? But I performed well on the test, and when the inspector told me to park the car at the end of the exam, I drove so carefully that I thought he might penalize me for going too slowly. Once I could legally drive, I became a one-man taxi service. It was one's obligation to give rides to comrades and friends. I was thus deputized to take the letter to Dr. Moroka. This was no hardship to me, as I have always found it enjoyable to gaze out of the window while driving. I seemed to have my best ideas while driving through the countryside with the wind whipping through the window. On my way down to Thabaneho, I passed through Kroonstad, a conservative free state town about 120 miles south of Johannesburg. I was driving up a hill and saw two white boys ahead of me on bicycles. My driving was still a bit unsteady and I came too close to them, one of whom suddenly made a turn without signaling, and we collided. He was knocked off his bicycle and was groaning when I got out of the car to help him. He had his arms out, indicating that I should pick him up. But just as I was about to do so, a white truck driver yelled for me not to touch the boy. The truck driver scared the child, who then dropped his arms as though he did not want me to pick him up. The boy was not badly hurt, and the truck driver took him to the police station, which was close by. The local police arrived a short time later, and the white sergeant took one look at me and said, "Kafir Kafir, you will shit today. I was shaken by the accident and the violence of his words. But I told him in no uncertain terms that I would shit when I pleased, not when a policeman told me to. At this, the sergeant took out his notebook to record my particulars. Afrikaners policemen were surprised if a black man could speak English, much less answer back.